Oh, hi, I'm Aisha. I'm a poli-sci major. I'm a senior this year.
I'm Amy, I'm a sophomore and I'm studying business.
I'm Matt, I'm a senior and I'm studying business and communication.
I'm Natalia, I'm a sophomore and I'm studying biology.
I'm Rachel, I'm a freshman and I'm studying psychology with a minor in intercultural studies.
I'm Carol, I'm just here for the symposium.
I'm Liana. I am a senior and I'm studying intercultural studies and ecology.
I'm Abby, I'm a senior and I'm studying art and international law.
I'm Michael, I'm a junior and a business student with minor in innovation.
All right, now we all know everything about each other. So here's the plan. I have some notes and some slides. Can you hear me okay? You back? Okay. I'll try to talk for just half an hour and then you can just talk about whatever. Like you can ask questions about how you get a job like this, what does that entail, really anything. Because I found that like 10 years into doing this sort of thing that like what I tend to prepare is way less interesting than other things. So be prepared before no. So all right, I'm gonna give you, have any of you heard me talk before, either like over the phone in one of doing Mia Kiti's classes?
Oh, my.
She's been having me do those since 2005. Or maybe somewhere else? No? Okay, I'll presume you don't have any knowledge then. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Micah Challenge, a little bit about myself, and that journey of like how we as a global advocacy campaign to end extreme poverty got into the creation care stuff will hopefully give some insight into theology, policy, like how we do our work, and hopefully charge you up to get involved in all this good stuff on your campus. Which, by the way, you are in the middle of nowhere, and it is beautiful that there's like so much energy on this campus for everything happening in the world. You know what I mean? Like that is rare and beautiful. So just remember that and like soak it in for a second because that's a blessing. It's pretty cool. I mean, yeah, I visit places that are way more connected geographically, that are way more disconnected emotionally and mentally from the rest of the world. So that's pretty awesome. So Micah Challenge is a global Christian movement that was started in 2002 officially, but we didn't really figure out what we were doing until 2004, 2005, and we didn't really figure out what we were doing until like about a year ago. But these are just some images from my work and some of my colleagues' work. So this is really hard to see, but it's a little man. His name's John Beckett. He's my colleague in Australia. This is at Hillsong Church, if you know the band Hillsong. They have a huge mega church. So they did a whole conference there about corruption in extractive industries and mining and how it's affecting the poor globally. I mean, imagine a megachurch in the U.S. having an entire conference to talk about that. I don't know that it would happen, but it was pretty cool to see them do that. This is a Micah Challenge campaign for maternal health that Micah Challenge South Africa organized. That was all about reforming the health system to benefit impoverished women rather than take advantage of them. I can give you some more of the details about that. That image is from a campaign we did in 2012, I think it was, where we tried to get the presidential candidates to talk about how they as president would respond to global needs, not out of charity, but out of duty, given that we, in many of our companies, many of our policies perpetuate these problems. So what's our responsibility to respond to them? Not out of like greatness and being benevolent, but more like just being realistic. Like, hey, we have interests all over the world. We've perpetuated extreme poverty. We've perpetuated exploitation through various policies. What are we going to do about that? One of them responded, which was cool. And then this last one, it's in French, so if you can read French, you can read that sign. But that is Micah Challenge in Benin. And they mobilized women to march for basically maternal health. It was the same year that South Africa was working on that. Just to give you just a broad scope of like what we do looks like. We were founded by Christian leaders from all over the world, particularly in the global south, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, who've been doing like relief work, been doing community development, been doing long-term in their own community development for decades. And they all come together and have this huge party every 3 years called the Micah Network. We just did it last week in Peru. That was this year was one of those 3 years. So I just got back from Peru about a week ago. So yeah, we get together every 3 years and basically cry to each other about how hard the work is, encourage each other, pray with each other, all that stuff. So these folks have been doing that for a long time, and they started to realize, man, the community development we do, the direct service we do in our own communities, remember these are mostly people, leaders from, indigenous leaders from these places. A handful of your like World Visions and World Reliefs are part of this, but they rarely come to the party, just to be frank. And they were basically having a discussion of like, man, the work we do on the ground is so limited by powers and structures that are beyond what we can influence or what we've always thought we could influence. There are systems in place and policies and structures, and particularly corruption, that undermines all the work we do. Just totally undermines everything we do for maternal health, everything we do for literacy. It just can get obliterated overnight, either because of bad policy, so either land is stolen, or illegal things, or simply just unethical things, like corporations extracting minerals from a country, not paying any kind of taxes on that, underreporting how much gold, for example, they took out, and then that's X number of millions of dollars that could be spent on education, healthcare, whatever that is now, who knows where, disappeared somewhere. So they created Micah Challenge as basically an idea. They're like, we need a Christian voice that's our voice that's going to speak out and hold these leaders accountable. Because right now, we can keep doing community development, and that's what we know how to do, but if we don't have somebody in our corner fighting for us in the halls of power, all of these policies will continue to undermine the work. So that's how we were born. But it took us a while to figure out how to get good at that because we were mostly preachers. Like I'm a local church pastor part-time. That's like what I know to do. And I studied international development at Calvin College. Back then it was called Third World Development Studies. It's embarrassing to say you have a degree in Third World Development Studies though, so we call it international development now. But anyway, that's where Micah Challenge came from. So I give you all that background because it's kind of important to see like our core commitment is the issue of extreme poverty and all the tangential things that perpetuate and undermine progress in overcoming that. Secondly, we don't work in direct service or community development. We write campaigns. We try to mobilize people. We do lobbying. I've gotten to do fun things with my job, like meeting with ministers of agriculture or health or mining from various countries around the world, meeting with UN ambassadors, trying to convince them that their country should make a commitment on certain health objectives or combating HIV and AIDS or whatever it is over the years. We do that kind of work. Our partners, though, just as a side note, the people who founded Micah Challenge in a lot of other countries, they don't make this distinction between like, oh, I do advocacy and campaigning or I do community development. They just do everything. In the U.S., we definitely make that distinction. So a lot of our partners in the U.S. focus on the development side of things, and then they feed into our policy work and everything we do on the advocacy side of things. So this year, for the first time, we launched a campaign on an issue that at first glance wasn't totally related to what our core commitments have always been. So, when we did a campaign a few years ago called Shine a Light on Corruption, nobody batted an eye. They're like, yeah, corruption hurts people living in poverty. Corruption perpetuates poverty. We did a campaign on getting the presidential candidates to make commitments. Nobody was like, what does that have to do with poverty? Because it was kind of in the name of the campaign. But this year we came out with the campaign on climate change. And I think, well, Brian Webb, I don't know, what do you guys call him? Do you call him Brian?
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, there was one of like 3 or 4 people who called me in a 3-week period back this spring. And all these people allegedly did this independently, but called and said, we need a Christian campaign on climate change, and we want Micah Challenge to help us lead this. And the first person, I was like, yeah, that's cool, you guys, good luck with that. And then Brian called, and I'm like, who's this guy? How does he even know my number? And then somebody from Paris called and said, we at the World Evangelical Alliance really want to see this happen, and we think it should be Micah Challenge to lead it. And I was like, why are you calling me? And it just kept happening, and finally I was like, maybe God is trying to steer us in a certain direction. But what really pushed us into this work was, before we do any campaign, we survey all the Micah Challenge people around the world. And we basically say, like, is this, we're dipping our toe in the water on this, does this issue matter to you and to your community? If we mobilize Christians around this, is that going to help you in what you're doing? And unanimously, Africa, Latin America, Asia, everyone we talked to, from Nepal to Cambodia to Pakistan to Peru to Ecuador, we talked to a lot of people, and everybody said climate change is perhaps one of the greatest threats to our community overcoming extreme poverty, and we need you to speak about it. So that kind of sealed the deal for us. So we got involved in this campaign, Climate Caretakers, which I think you heard about in chapel the other day. I'll mention more about it in a little bit. So how did we get into that? Well, basically, when we were surveying communities to find out how climate change is affecting them, we learned about drought and floods and how that affects farming. And so you have a lot of folks living in subsistence agriculture who lose crops 2 or 3 years in a row to drought, and then all of a sudden it rains, but it doesn't just rain, it floods. So when you have 4 years of crop loss, you definitely have famine. And so for me, my first experience with any of this was in 2009. One of those parties I mentioned we have every 3 years. We did one in 2009 in Kenya. After the meeting, I went over to Uganda, met with my colleague there, and I was like, what's the biggest challenge facing you all right now? And I knew it was a dumb question because he just finished showing me all of this barren land and basically how people have been starving and how they're having a new famine outbreak on the eastern side of Uganda. And I thought he was going to say hunger. He was like, climate change. Climate change is our biggest problem right now. So that was 2009. That really stuck with me, kind of haunted me. There is a huge effect on fishing. Acidic water makes it harder for fish to survive. Fishing communities struggle with that. Conflict has been perhaps one of the worst impacts of this, is that when you have people no longer able to live where they live because of flooding or because of famine or because of whatever it is, you have resource wars. There are people right now, some analysts who say what's going on in Syria is largely a resource war. We already have resource wars if you talk about oil as a resource. But soon we're going to see wars around water. That will for sure happen. It makes me sad to say that, but it's going to happen. And so conflict has been a major problem. Migration, people leaving areas that are no longer arable land, going to the cities, more waterborne diseases, etc. The list goes on. I just listed some of the things we heard when we were trying to listen around how does climate change impact people living in extreme poverty in your community. So it became really clear to us we've got to do something. And then finally, at that party in Kenya that I mentioned, no one calls it a party but me, by the way. That's not like the official Micah term. It's actually called the Triennial Global Consultation, which is too hoity-toity for me, so I call it a party. But I'll actually be happy to send this to anyone who wants it, but every time we meet, we produce a document. And that document goes through a massive process of lots of voices writing it, lots of people speaking into it, and then we all sign it. So this is just a portion of that document. I'm not going to read it all to you. But it is theological, it is practical, it has some policy implications, but it really is also like a confession. I mean, we repent of our self-serving theology of creation, our complicity in unjust local and global economic relationships. We repent of those aspects of our individual and corporate lifestyles that harm creation, our lack of political action. We must radically change our lives in response to God's indignation and sorrow for his creation's agony. And then there's obviously hopeful stuff too. Like, we will strive to live sustainably, rejecting consumerism, the resulting exploitation. We will teach and model care of creation and integral mission. We will intercede before God for the most affected by environmental degradation and climate change. We'll act with justice and mercy among, with, and on behalf of them. So this document came out in 2009. People often refer to it as the first evangelical institutional admission of human-caused climate change. I don't know if that's true. I just hear other people at other more important organizations touting this when they talk about the issue. But in 2009, the Micah Challenge released whatever, and I was like, people read those things? So anyway, that's how we got into it. Was that our vision of a world without extreme poverty, we realized, could not be achieved without addressing this issue. We tried to leave it to other people. I will talk, if that camera was off, no, I'm joking. I speak very frankly, I don't care who sees what. There's another there's many Christian environmental organizations who I called earlier this year and said, will you please run this campaign and get into this work? Because that's not our bag. Our deal is corruption and fighting, unjust laws and this kind of stuff, and just raising the profile of biblical justice as a theological imperative, this and that. We can't get into this climate business. And it just became really clear. People were afraid to talk about it, were afraid to campaign about it, were afraid to really invest a lot of time in what they saw as a losing issue. But the reality is this is a huge problem. I've heard it loud and clear from my brothers and sisters in Micah Challenge around the world. And we need to do something. So, actually, I'll tell you, no, I'm not going to tell you that story. I'm going to park that. I might tell you another story that's pretty good. So how do we do what we do? So, traditional advocacy is, actually, Alexi gave a pretty good, were you all in chapel today, or how many people? A lot of no, it's okay. She gave a pretty good, compelling story of just the way that they use people power, community organizing to make some change where they live. Now, issue-based advocacy, which is more let's not talk about our neighborhood, but let's talk about this huge issue and get people to talk about it. Sometimes employs, and even community organizing, tactics, principles, and kind of has a posture that feels pretty inconsistent with our faith. And it took us a while to realize that. So it was almost like we were putting on clothes that didn't really fit us. So when I got hired on at Micah Challenge, I was fresh out of college. It was 2005. Immediately, I went to a training with this something called the Industrial Areas Foundation, or IAF. It was founded by a guy named Saul Alinsky. Have you heard the name Saul Alinsky before? He's the godfather of community organizing. He wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. You should look it up. But basically, the premise is that the ends always justify the means. So when you're working for justice, you do whatever it takes, however you have to get the power to achieve your goal. And that's the training I went to. And I was the only person of faith that I knew. I was sitting in the room and I was like, man, something about this just doesn't really sit with me. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable. We did a scenario. Actually, the scenario we ran was in Syracuse, and it was about, well, I won't tell you that story either. It's a good story, so we'll park that one too. But anyway, what we've done is we've had to basically say, okay, traditional organizing and campaigning and advocacy uses power through coercion, sometimes through really good things, just by mobilizing the masses, but oftentimes through shame, through guilt, through coercion, and really relies on our power. And and what power we can become. It also tends to be very outward looking and not very introspective. And so we've gone through a whole process as an organization of rethinking how we do it, how we do advocacy, and how we do it as people who follow Jesus, and what does it look like and how is it different. So this is the definition of transformational advocacy that we use. And this is what I think we need to respond to an issue like climate change if we want to see justice for all creation. Challenging ourselves and our leaders to change attitudes, behaviors, and policies that perpetuate injustice and denying God's will for all creation to flourish. This didn't come easily. This was the end of like maybe 36 hours of 25 people crammed in a room in Colorado Springs. And these are people from Compassion International, from World Vision, from World Relief, from every big and small organization you can imagine, fighting and wordsmithing what is advocacy and how do we do it as Christians. So don't take for granted when you read a really good definition. That means somebody worked hard on it. But anyway, this fits us better. These clothes fit. So when we tried to put on like this outfit of like we're a powerful political campaigning machine that's going to change the world and coerce the powers to bend to our whim, whatever, we just weren't good at that. But when we look at challenging ourselves and like really examining before God, like how is my life perpetuating injustice? Reveal that to me. How can I live differently? How is my organization? How do we as Micah Challenge? We are an institution that moves through the world. We buy things. We invest money in banks. We do all those things. How are we living? Are we living in rightness with you, God? And just really being introspective. And that gives us a whole lot of integrity when we do speak out to governments on policies. We do challenge corporations on practices to say, look at how we, as this little organization in our churches, have changed the way we live to respond to this. And we invite you to do the same. It gives us a lot of integrity. It makes us humble because we always know that our lives are sustained by the same oppression we're trying to end. I mean, admitting that, releasing that, asking God to free us from that is a pretty amazing place to start from when you want to mobilize people in advocacy. It gives you a humility. So does this work? Does it actually make change? So a really good case study for the impact of advocacy movements is the Jubilee Debt Campaign. Have any of you heard about this? I see some heads, yes, some no. So back in, how old were you all in the year 2000? Just someone shout out.
5.
Yeah, 5, 6.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was 17, so I was like, I was old enough to remember this going on, but I wasn't old enough to be like in the streets marching. So basically, there was a crisis of the fact that there was a lot of irresponsible lending that happened in the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of trying to influence, basically trying to buy influence from nations, especially poor nations, to either be, well, yeah, I won't have to go into all the details. There was a lot of irresponsible lending, and money was loaned to governments at really high interest rates. So like a great example is in South Africa. When Nelson Mandela became president, he inherited $15 billion of debt as the nation of South Africa. So his whole cabinet was like, we're not paying this debt. That went to a government that oppressed us, repressed us, put you in jail, murdered people, totally, destroyed our country. They shouldn't have given those crazy people money. And Nelson Mandela was like, you're right, they shouldn't have given them money, but I don't want to ruin the credit rating of our nation, because nations have credit ratings just like people do. So he paid back the debt. They paid back $19 billion. 15 billion of principal, 4 billion of interest, and when he was no longer president, they still owed 30 billion because the interest rates were in the thousands of percentage points. So when I say like irresponsible lending, it was usury. It was totally like, hey, here's a dictator who doesn't care at all about his nation or about anything. Let's give him a $2 billion loan at a 4,000% interest rate or whatever. So it was really absurd. It was totally absurd and irresponsible. So what that meant though was a lot of really impoverished nations inherited these horrible debts that they had no way of paying. So you had some nations like Kenya was paying 30% of the national budget was debt repayment on money that they shouldn't have been lent in the first place, to be honest, because it wasn't spent on good things. So there was this big movement, the Jubilee Debt Campaign, and it was named for the idea of Jubilee in Scripture, this idea that every 50 years debts will be canceled, land will be given back to the original owners, slaves will be set free, because God knew that if left to our own devices, we would take advantage of each other, we would exploit each other, and that we needed this natural reset about every 50 years to set things back to normal. So the Jubilee Debt Campaign campaigned to cancel the debt of, I think it was 75 nations, and it was a movement. It was not just an advocacy campaign, it was a social movement. There were people proclaiming Jubilee who had no idea that the concept Jubilee came from Scripture. You had celebrities talking about it. You had the Pope was talking about it. The Vatican had a huge Jubilee mass, basically, during one of the G8 summits. It penetrated every level of society. You had corporations talking about Jubilee. You had everybody was talking about Jubilee. There were literally 24 million people who signed the petition. It's one of the biggest petitions in the history of people counting petition signatures. 24 million people in Peru, where I was last week, 4 million people in the nation of Peru signed, which is like much of the country. It was a movement. It was a massive movement. And it succeeded. There was hundreds of billions of dollars of debt canceled, and there continues to be debt canceled. And the beautiful thing is that that was long enough ago that we've actually been able to see the impact of those canceled debts. So and now, I'll tell you the full story because it's not all pretty, but with money that they saved from paying back the debt, Tanzania built 2,000 schools, 32,000 classrooms. Zambia abolished user fees at health clinics, so if it's a government-run health clinic, it's now free. 3,600 teachers were hired in Malawi. 2.2 million people gained access to clean water in Uganda. All of that with money that was saved from having to repay a debt. Now, did it save everything? No. A bunch of those schools don't have teachers in them. You can visit, I have visited today, a school that has a plaque in Uganda that says, built with money from the Jubilee campaign or whatever, but there's no teacher. And so the fight has to continue, but it was a really beautiful start to secure some kind of just playing level for things to proceed on. And I have a pretty cool video about that if you want. I can email you the link or something that tells that story. It's pretty short, it's like 8 minutes. So advocacy can really work, and it's easy, especially people my age and younger, to get really cynical of advocacy, because the biggest movements we've seen don't actually work very well, and they tend to be less about an issue and more about an organization's profile or a person's personality. They seem to be pretty uninformed. Some of the biggest campaigns of my lifetime that I remember had some of the worst policy implications I could ever imagine, but they're the ones that took off. And so why is any of this relevant? Because I think that we will not actually see change in climate change without another movement of that scale. We need something like the Jubilee. We need people in school to study social movements, to study things like the Jubilee effort, because it simply won't happen with you and I deciding to recycle more, and you and I deciding to reduce our own emissions and carbon footprint. That's super valuable. Don't let me degrade those decisions. And it won't happen just from us cleaning up our own rivers and our own watersheds and trying to reduce emissions in our cities and this and that. The impact of climate change is big enough that we need a massive, massive movement. And so there's, for whatever reason, people like me who have signed up to try and help build that. And there's a lot of good stuff happening. And I think if you watch the news in November, there'll be a lot of stuff happening in Paris around this, because there's a big meeting then where discussions about how do big nations, how do the G20 nations, how are they going to reduce carbon emissions? What does that really look like? China just announced yesterday that they're going to do a cap and trade system, which if you don't know what that means, you've like heard it thrown around. Basically, it creates a tax for how much carbon emissions you produce. So if you're a huge manufacturing corporation or you're some other industry that's producing a lot of emissions, you're going to have to pay a tax based on how much you want to emit into the atmosphere. And if you want to emit more, you got to pay more. You got to buy that. That's been really resistant here in the U.S. Now that China has it, that might actually move us to having something similar, because there's a good chance they could impose some kind of, and if this is too technical and boring, just let me know. But there's a good chance China, for example, could say, oh, we have a new tariff or tax on any incoming goods that haven't paid their carbon tax. So we're going to charge you that tax. And no American corporation wants to pay taxes to China. They don't want to pay taxes for carbon, and first of all, to be polluters, but if they're going to pay those, they don't want to pay them to China. So there's a lot that could happen with this. There's a ton happening right now. Today, in the United Nations General Assembly, there's going to be a lot of discussions. This meeting in Paris is going to be a big moment. Some people say there'll be over 1 million people who show up in Paris to do movement type stuff, to be like the new Jubilee type movement. So my prayer, my hope is that the church is not on the sidelines for this, but that we're really a part of it. That we are at the forefront of it. And by church, I mean like the big C. I mean people who follow Jesus, whether you're Catholic, evangelical, whatever it is, whether you're a student, whether you're part of a local church, not. Like this is a chance for us to show the world the best of who our God is. This is a chance to like really help undo some of the bad PR we have given Jesus in the last couple hundred years. It's a chance to really stand for values that are in Scripture, that really reflect the heart of God. And so I'm excited about it. This is a quote from Bishop David Zach in Uganda. Have any of you heard of him? He's a pretty awesome dude. He leads a movement there called the Black Monday Movement. But he said, the reasons for climate change is the alliance of the powerful to continue to degrade the world. So Christian people must engage with the powerful through policies. The laws don't work for the poor, and they don't work for preserving creation. They work to exploit both. He sounds really negative, but he says positive things too. So finally, Climate Caretakers is the campaign we helped launch and we help run now. And it's in the very early stages, but I'd encourage you to get involved. Just look it up, talk to Brian about it. He's basically like the brains behind a lot of it. That's my info. You can get in touch with me about anything. There's a good chance if you do email me, you might hear back from someone else at Micah Challenge, because I'm notorious for not responding to my emails. But I do like hearing directly from students especially. That's a book that I edited and put together called Live Justly, and it really helps like unpack the theological mandate of like what is justice, what is our mission in the world, how do we live this out, how do we not treat justice like this thing on the side, but how does it infuse itself into our lifestyle, into the way we consume, into the way we pray, to the way we do relationships, all of that stuff. And that's being used by a lot of college campuses to kind of help take this justice conversation from something that happens once in a while in chapel to like just penetrating the general ethos of the campus. And we've seen a lot of cool stuff come out of that. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, and that gives us plenty of time for questions. I could tell you all the stories I said I would park off to the side. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, do you have any questions?
Do you want us to like raise our hands?
You just talk.
What is, like, of all of the different movements you've been part of, which one speaks most to your own personal, like, passions?
That's a good question. I would say that know the answer, I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. Well, in my world, where I work, advocacy movements, especially in North America, tend to be really focused on like things that don't necessarily grab at my heart. Like, and I've had to run campaigns on these issues, like foreign aid, foreign assistance, protecting those fundings, making sure they're used for what they're supposed to be used for. I think that's good for sure. There are literally 6 million people who are receiving antiretroviral AIDS drugs from the U.S. government right now around the world. If that disappeared overnight, that would be wildly inappropriate. So I care about that for sure. But when you look at like the grand scheme of where the source of a lot of this poverty or health issues or the things that like foreign assistance, for example, is trying to help with, it's really a justice issue. And a lot of that has to do with natural resources and just the use of land and people and minerals. So we worked on this campaign that was basically trying to get a lot more transparency in oil, gas, and mining industries. And there's actually a lot happening with it right now, but we are quieter because we're working so much on the climate issue. So that, I guess we called it Shine a Light. Globally, it was called Exposed. And there was like 175,000 people who signed our petition around the world. And we delivered it. Micah Challenge Australia delivered it for all of us, Micah Challenges from around the world, to the G20 meeting that was in Australia last November. There was a lot of really cool press coverage around that because it was basically 175,000 Christians saying this, you know, the lack of transparency in mining and extractive industries in general is kind of the umbrella to talk about these kinds of things, is destroying the livelihoods of communities across the world. You go to places like Zambia, for example, and there are copper mines run by either US or European companies, and there are people working in these mines in horrible conditions, living in extreme poverty, and there's literally hundreds of millions of dollars of copper being extracted from this place. Somebody's benefiting. It is not those people who live and work on that land. And so that to me is like a really core justice issue that is so old. I mean, colonialism goes back to issues of extraction and natural resources and minerals. I mean, it's just, and I also just think like God didn't create places in this world where people should live in squalor. And when you look at some of the most impoverished places on the planet, like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's like the most natural resource rich country in the world, perhaps. We're talking like more fresh water, minerals, gold, everything that you can imagine, but people are living in abject poverty and in war and in conflict, and it's all like fighting over these resources. And so that campaign really speaks to my heart and like something I connect with a lot, because I think a lot of people in my field are also afraid to talk about corruption or something. Like that's something that really conservative people talk about. It's like, no, corruption's a huge issue. We're not going to get anywhere on the issue of poverty if we don't challenge that, and corruption's a hard issue. You know, we need to like take it seriously. That's kind of a babbling answer, but that would be it. I'm a talker, kind of. I'm like an introvert, but I can talk about this stuff forever. So be careful what you ask me.
What do you think made you like become passionate about those issues? Like what started you out in wanting to study international development?
Yeah, well, so I grew up very aware of my privilege in the world, because my parents immigrated here and didn't have very much at all and worked really, really hard to give me a good life and my brothers. And also was just hyper aware that if I had been born in Egypt, my life would be totally different. That my, you know, one, as a Christian family, always living in fear, or at least experiencing daily discrimination, if not violence and persecution. And my parents didn't hide that from me growing up. So like we would pray fervently for violence that Christians in Egypt were facing. And there's a very deep relationship between poverty and persecution that I don't think the North American church ever talks about. When they talk about the persecuted church, they don't talk about that synonymous with poverty, but it is. If you're wealthy, it doesn't matter really where you live, you have a better chance of escaping that kind of violence and discrimination. It is like poor Christians, at least in Egypt, that's what I can speak to, who are experiencing horrific things. So I remember my dad learning, because he would read like an Arabic language newspaper every Saturday, and I remember him reading about a guy that he knew who was in the news because he was murdered at his own daughter's wedding in front of everybody, and no police did anything about it. There was no arrests made, there was nothing, and it was all because of basically the government refused to allow these people in my dad's hometown to build a church. It's like one of the laws they had to like discourage Christianity and growth of the church, etc. was like any time you wanted to do anything to a church, even paint the wall, you had to get presidential approval. This is an exaggeration, this is like a law. You wanted to paint like a wall, you needed former President Mubarak to sign the approval. So you can imagine he never did that. So they were tired of waiting for the approval to build a church, so he built a church on his private property. And that's what caused these people to respond by murdering him. So I was like 7 when that happened, and I just saw that and saw my dad and mom grieving, and I just grew up super aware that like I was very privileged, that God was not okay with any of this, that like as much as I saw grief in my parents and them like doing everything, like I went with my dad to protest the Egyptian government once in Chicago when they were there for some fancy dinner, and that was amazing. And you know, I just saw them like, my parents had this fierceness about this injustice that Christians face in Egypt, and I just knew that God shared that so much even more than my parents did. That like if my parents were grieved at this, if my parents and me were angry about whatever injustice was happening, God was that much angrier. And so I just grew up knowing that like this is what God wants for me, is to work for justice in the world. Now how I got into this field in particular, I wanted to move abroad and like be kind of like a community development worker. Like I wanted to work for Mennonite Central Committee or somebody and just like be a farmer, you know, meet like a local girl, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I got impatient as a college student. I was like, everything I hear about how I can be a part of God's work in the world is for who I am after I graduate. And I'm sick of that. There's got to be something I can do now. So as a student, I just started organizing stuff on campus, like bringing in speakers or showing a film and having like refugees in our town come and share about how that film relates to their experience. Or, you know, we just did all this stuff. And before I knew it, we were generating like hundreds of letters to our member of Congress. His office had to come and talk to us about, we were writing him about the issue of, it had to do with the conflict in Sudan at the time. This was like 2002, 2003. And it was the early days of the conflict in Western Sudan. We were trying to get it labeled as a genocide because after the Rwandan genocide, there's new international kind of like conventions, and when something becomes a genocide, the world has to respond to stop that craziness from ever happening again. So we were fighting to try and make that happen, and I got to really engage with my member of Congress and get to know him and to see us influence him. This old man who like really had no reason to listen to us, but was moved by our passion passion by the Holy Spirit, whatever, and who like really went to bat on issues that we cared about. A lot of times in opposition to his own party, and it was amazing. So that was like my last couple years of college, was just being this like campaigner on campus, and people called me the Zach Morris of social justice. If you know what the show Saved by the Bell is. And that was like all I did. I stopped going to class, all that stuff. That was all I did. And so don't do that. So then by the time I was graduating, I was like, man, maybe before I move to wherever, you know, work for MCC or whoever it is, like I kind of want to do this for a while. Like my own faith has been enlivened from this. My whole campus was just taken by storm for like this movement of God towards justice. And like we had weekly meetings that we'd get 75 people to show up weekly. We'd have events that 500 people would show up to. I mean, it was like our whole campus was just swept with this like passion for justice. It was really beautiful. So I didn't want to give up on that. I was like, man, I could learn agricultural techniques for the Savannah climate or whatever, and then go teach that somewhere. But I kind of want to. There is like a sleeping movement of North American Christians, especially young people, who are not satisfied with a Christianity that has nothing to say about injustice. And I want to help be a part of waking that up. So that was 10 years ago. I've kind of been flying by the seat of my pants ever since.
That's awesome.
It's not always fun. I mean, it's like, there are definitely times where I'm like, what am I doing? I don't remember when the camera on. No, there's a few times where I've said things where I'm like, I hope that anyone ever sees this video. Yeah, it's like, this kind of work isn't just a job. And you're hearing one perspective. I have plenty of friends who this is just a job. They're like, they work at one place until they get a better offer at the next place, and they kind of move their way up, and then they want to go work for a member of Congress, and then they want to do this or that. And for me though, this is like a deeply rooted conviction in ministry. Like God wants to see the world redeemed on so many levels, and this is part of that work, and it's like a privilege to be a part of it, and it's not always easy, that's for sure. Any other questions, thoughts?
You came up with the title of on earth as it is in heaven. Can you kind of just like, I mean, I kind of have a general idea of why, but
Yeah.
would you just?
For me, that's like, well, one, I came up with the most generic title I could so that I had the freedom to just say whatever. That's something I learned a long time ago. Don't pigeonhole yourself into anything. But yeah, that's theologically, that's been like this idea of shalom, of like God restoring all things to the way God intended things to be. And that Christ's redemptive work in our own lives also expands to these systems. It expands to the climate. It expands to everything that is fallen. And so that phrase from the Lord's Prayer is like a huge inspiration to me and to a lot of the work we've done at Micah Challenge. That like we want God's reign and God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. And I think that something like climate change shouldn't be talked about as a political issue. It should be talked about as a kingdom issue, because it is a part of that cycle of on earth as it is in heaven. And anything I can do to help bring a conversation about climate change out of a heated, political, angry debate and into a debate about God's kingdom coming and God's will being done is, work that's worthy of doing. So, yeah, that's where the title came from.
Do you have any words of wisdom for someone that who would want to go into this type of work after graduation? Maybe not like the
don't always wait for what seems like the perfect opportunity.
Mm.
In the sense that like your way into this kind of ministerial work like may not look like what you dreamed of. But any way in is a way in. So I guess that basically what I'm saying is like I have a lot of friends who wanted to do this kind of work and now are, you know, working as lawyers to protect insurance companies from having to pay out money that they really should be paying. Or they work as investment bankers and I hit them up for donations. And they're investing money in the very corporations that we're trying to like create more transparency around. A lot of times oil is a huge investment area. And so those aren't bad things. It's just that those are people I know when we graduated, they wanted to like work for Micah Challenge or for World Vision or for whoever it was. And I think a lot of people wait for what seems like the perfect opportunity. And sometimes I think just going for whatever you can is a great way to get started, or making your own way. I mean, I didn't apply for a job at Micah Challenge. Like I said, this was a Global South movement. It didn't exist in the U.S. I started my own organization that was like called the Campus Justice Network. That was going to be me trying to organize a bunch of college campuses to do advocacy around different justice issues at the same time. Micah Challenge wanted a U.S. presence, so we kind of met and talked about calling my thing Micah Challenge, and that just being the U.S. version of it. We both agreed to it, and then I was basically just told, like, cool, you have a name now, get at it. I mean, it wasn't like there was some big office somewhere I sent an application to and like had an interview at. I don't even have a resume. So yeah, a lot of times I'm not encouraging you to like make your own way, but sometimes that's how it goes. So yeah, I don't know, that'd be a word of wisdom, is just be willing to like, don't wait to do what you want to do, I guess. Because if I had waited for someone to post a job that was like, organize college students in transformational advocacy for God's kingdom, I would have never seen it, you know? And so sometimes I think you can just go after something.